As illustrated in scenes from across the universe, anti-war protests in the 1960s could be both violent and peaceful. No matter what they wanted to call it, no matter how many times they said their guys were over there only advising the South Vietnamese army, Americans knew there was a war on. Young men with bright futures were going over to Vietnam to fight and to die. But low U.S. morale wasn't the only issue. There was growing unease over the government's role in the conflict and the world's seemingly uncertain future. This unease turned inward and seeped into American households. Parents and teenagers were fighting endlessly about the war. The adult generation believed the war was necessary, that America was duty-bound to go over and help. The younger generation thought differently. They believed the war was only going to hurt an unstable world all the more, and that American involvement was making things worse. Kids are notorious for defying their parents and going completely against their wishes. However, their anti-Vietnam War feelings would go much farther than just regular teen angst. Young people and college students played a huge role in Vietnam War protests and brought media and public attention to a huge example of a world in crisis. The majority of college students believed in equality of races and social standing. They were the first generation passionate enough to rise up against old social standings in an effort to make a change in America and to impact the world for ages to come. Students supporting the anti-war movement and blacks pushing for civil rights joined the organization that was first known as the Student Peace Union, but became known in 1960 as the Students for Democratic Society. The anti-war movement was also strongly connected with the civil rights movement that was going on. While many white students were campaigning to end the war, African Americans of all ages, especially students, were struggling for equality. Thus, these two groups, which shared many of the same ideas, were destined to join. From the beginning of the war to around 1963, Americans were relatively quiet in terms of anti-war protests. However, after the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, there was an upsurge in protests and demonstrations against the Vietnam War. Despite this rise in demonstrations, many Americans did not believe this movement was going to last or was anything to worry about. At this point, the movement was only in its infancy. This changed in 1964 after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The U.S. government now had an excuse to increase the amount of U.S. troops sent to Vietnam. Many Americans began to wonder why America was involved in the war. At campuses across the country, anti-war protests were staged. The majority of the older generation believed that not only did the United States have the right to intervene in Vietnam, but it was also their duty to put an end to the communistic government. The younger generation, besides being against fighting in general, did not think the U.S. government had the right to get involved in a conflict that did not involve the United States directly, and their presence was just making matters worse. In homes of college campuses across the country, young people were rallying to have their voices heard in a war being run by the government. At colleges, students were attending teach-ins, discussions about current political events that were geared towards participation and action. The University of Michigan hosted the first teach-in on March 24th to the 25th in 1965. The events included lectures, debates, and musical events dedicated to protesting the war. These events gave the average person a better sense of what was going on in the war and what they could do to put a stop to the violence. Besides teach-ins, young people were getting involved in marches and public protests.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War in mass marches, rallies, and demonstrations. Central Park is the starting point for the parade to the UN building. The estimated 125,000 Manhattan marchers include students, housewives, beatnik poets, doctors, businessmen, teachers, priests, and nuns. Makeup and costumes were bizarre.
1965 also saw the first of many draft riots. Young men who were physically eligible to fight were issued draft cards and expected to show up to draft offices, ready and willing to fight when their names were called. However, much like Gandhi and his followers, who had burned their identification papers to spread their message to those in power, young men who were against the war burned their draft cards to show the government the strength of their aversion to the war. From 1968 to 1972, the anti-war movement was at its height. President Nixon was elected in 1968 with the promise that he would end the war in Vietnam. Although this might have sounded like an ideal, he was determined to not let the United States be humiliated and was not willing to give up the effort in Vietnam under any circumstances, like the younger generation had hoped for. The silent majority, as the protesters were called, refused to accept any U.S. involvement in the war. The movement came to be led by people known as hippies, who believed in peace and non-discrimination. However, while most of the country wanted to stop involvement in Vietnam, many Americans did not want to join the movement that was led by hippies because they disapproved of their drug use and style of living. Nixon had a long-standing dislike and distrust of college students and hated seeing their defiance of his actions. He wanted to put a stop to the protests, but knew he needed help. With his order, peaceful protests could take a turn for the very worst. At the best of times, marches and protests were peaceful and consisted only of groups carrying anti-war signs and banners, singing protest songs and trying to pass their message along in a calm and controlled manner. However, these seemingly peaceful protests could easily turn violent, ending in brawls, arrests, and even deaths. The protest at Kent State University will forever be remembered for its horrifying violent outcome. On April 30th, 1970, Nixon announced on television and on the radio that he was bringing U.S. troops into Cambodia to attack the headquarters of the Viet Cong, thus bringing the country even further into the war. The next day, Friday, May 1st, saw protests on college campuses across the country, where angry students demanded to know how getting even more involved in the war would end it. Ohio's Kent State University also held a large rally where a copy of the Constitution was burned to represent how it was ignored the whole proceeding, as Congress never declared war. After the fiery demonstrations of that rally and the churning anger of the students, a second rally was scheduled for Monday, May 4th. However, May 1st hadn't gone exactly as planned. Fights had broken out among the students and the local police, and a state of emergency had been called by the governor, James Rhodes. Ohio National Guard members were called down to the campus, and students were told that as long as the guardsmen had control of the area, rallies were banned. Furious students showed up anyway and tried to gather together. Guardsmen chased the students away, but found themselves being pelted with rocks. By this point, guardsmen and students had run each other onto the practice football field on Blanket Hill. Then, without warning, 28 of the 70-plus guardsmen turned and fired into the crowd. When the shooting ended, 4 students were dead and another 9 were wounded. When other students heard about this tragedy, they formed a nationwide student strike, forcing hundreds of colleges and universities to close. But the shooting did not just affect students in the younger generation. The country as a whole was astounded. Even H.R. Haldeman, one of Nixon's top men, thought of the shootings as a direct impact on national politics. Had things actually gotten so bad that the National Guard was gunning down college students? In a written statement from the guardsmen present, they tried to explain their reasoning for the shootings.
In retrospect, the tragedy of May 4th, 1970 should not have occurred. The students may have believed that they were right in continuing their mass protest in response to the Cambodian invasion, even though this protest followed the posting and reading by the university of an order to ban rallies and an order to disperse. These orders have since been determined by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals to have been lawful. Some of the guardsmen on Blanket Hill, fearful and anxious from prior events, may have believed in their own minds that their lives were in danger. Hindsight suggests that another method would have resolved the confrontation. Better ways must be found to deal with such a confrontation. We devoutly wish that a means had been found to avoid the May 4th events accumulating in the guard shootings and the irreversible deaths and injuries. We deeply regret those events and are profoundly saddened by the deaths of 4 students and the wounding of 9 others which resulted. We hope that the agreement to end the litigation will help to assuage the tragic memories regarding that sad day.
Despite these words, people were still horrified at the event. A photograph from the event, showing a young girl crying over the body of a dying student, displayed the feeling of the entire nation in a single image. Whether or not they approved of the war, no one wanted kids to die trying to get their point across. Kent State was closed until the summer. Reverberations of the shootings were still being felt by the community and the country at large. What had been simply a difference of opinion and public displays of civil disobedience had sprouted into violence that rivaled what was occurring in Vietnam. However, people continued to rally with a new vigor. A banner hanging outside of New York University read, "They can't kill us all." Until the war was over, nothing could silence the protesters. Finally, under the pressure of anti-war activists, a policy of de-escalation took place. American troops were withdrawn from Vietnam, and a peace treaty was signed in 1973. The anti-war movement was filled with both peace and violence, but most of all, it was full of passion. Both parties involved felt strongly about their cause and were willing to do anything to achieve what they believed was right. This movement among the younger generation signified radical changes among American society and helped America as a country progress to modern times. It was during this time that the U.S. government lost the unfailing faith of the people, and everyday citizens became awakened to the idea that the government is not perfect and will not always make the right decisions. It is when both the people and the government work in harmony and listen to each other that our country can remain in peaceful times.